Hey James, thanks for being here.
Absolutely my pleasure.
You've been in the communications game for a long time. Maybe just to set this up, tell me a little bit about your background and kind of one of the unique approaches that you have, which is this view towards teaching organizations to be more empathetic in their communication strategy.
Well, you pretty much nailed the answer with the question, which is my approach to communications, whether it's on a personal level or on behalf of companies, organizations, not-for-profits, whatever. The rules of communication always work the same way. And my approach places a great deal of emphasis on the importance of empathy, caring enough about the person that you're speaking with that they understand the point of connection between you and their cares and concerns in a way that helps them to get on board with whatever it is that you're looking to achieve.
So how did you develop this approach, or did this approach evolve over time based on experience working with different people?
I think the approach started instinctively and came out as I tumbled backwards into my career. So I did not think that I was going to end up in marketing, communications, branding, or anything in that relation. I studied film and I studied English literature. And if looking at that, the stuff of storytelling is the stuff of what motivates people and what makes people care and act. So what I found when I started writing for design companies and advertising firms was that turning to the skill sets that I developed by analyzing and understanding literature and film and storytelling and applying those ideas to corporate culture, I would frequently surprise my clients, but usually in a delighted kind of way where they would say, wow, I never thought about it like that before. And there was value in that going forward over the years.
Can you maybe provide an example of maybe one of those aha moments that a client had based on some insight that you brought forward with this approach?
Working for a client in the educational sector, higher education, they were upset because one of their competitors had hit the marketplace with a very good advertising campaign. So they came to us and said, we need to do something about this. So we said, well, let's talk about it first. And when we talked about it, we said, what we think you should do is instead of going after a piece of the pie, you should go after the whole pie and hit the market with a campaign and with a brand positioning that states an understanding of the entire category and claims ownership of the category. So by understanding what students want from higher education and addressing that directly, you can claim ownership of the relationship between school and student in a way that pushes everyone else in the market out. So the solution was, what is higher education? Why do people invest in higher education? It's because education is transformational. At its most basic level, what you're looking for from education is transformation. I understand myself this way. I would like to understand myself differently through my career aspirations, through my intellectual capabilities, through the experience that I'm developing. Whatever it is that you sign on for, any program that you sign on for at school, you expect to come out the other end different. So just to complete it, the conclusion that we came to was that everybody who works for an educational institution is a change agent. And the promise of the brand was one of change for students and potential students.
How difficult is that to get across to the decision makers who are faced with maybe a communication challenge, which boils down to just do the same thing you did last year? Like, it seems like a radical shift in thinking.
It is a radical shift in thinking, which finds its foundation in the notion that the most effective thing that you can use as a communication tool is disruption. If you're doing what's expected, you shouldn't have any reason to expect that people will pay any attention to you at all. If you do something that's surprising and different, they will pay attention to you. If it's surprising and different in an irrelevant way, it won't do you any good at all. But if it's surprising and insightful, it will move people towards working with you.
And how much of you mentioned the word brand, how much of this communication is directly related to how organizations brand and position themselves in the marketplace?
From my point of view, for corporations or business entities, all communication is brand communication. Brand is a very complex sociological outcome of having meaningful control or management of how you position yourself, how you are seen to be, how you are felt to be, and that requires self-knowledge on behalf of the organization and consistency in the delivery of what you're on your promises.
Do you think that this approach where you can create this, surprise communication, this reaction by changing the way you communicate, does that apply to the majority of organizations, or only a certain type that have a certain persona in the marketplace?
It applies to the successful companies. I would argue that if you look at any of the names that you know, the reason why you know them is because they did a good job of understanding their target audience and demonstrating to that target audience that they are working towards their good as much as their own.
So in a landscape, in a Canadian landscape where there's 86,000 registered charities in this country, I'm going to put words in your mouth. I would suggest that you would say that properly branded, differentiated communication is a way to stand out in a crowded marketplace.
Well, absolutely. Everybody should do that so that everybody can be differentiated within a crowded marketplace. The likelihood of that happening is fairly low because it takes a mindset that includes some dexterity and alacrity, the ability to think in a human way rather than a corporate way. And the more that organizations are able to manage that into their processes, however big the organization is, the more successful they will be. But most of the energies of corporate existence push back against that. So a company or an organization or a not-for-profit needs to be very consciously dedicated to the idea of building and supporting their brand, and they need to have consciousness of whether or not they're doing that on an ongoing basis.
So I think about nonprofit and executive directors and board directors that are working in a charity that maybe they think they're struggling with their communications. What is a good litmus test for them to discover whether or not they actually need to change their focus?
I guess it would be how frustrated they are by their success rates. I would suggest that if you frequently ask people for money and the other people frequently say no, you might be asking them wrong, assuming that the thing you're asking them for the money for would otherwise be considered worthwhile. So you have to know that asking for money is an incredibly competitive landscape to be in. Most people who are in a position to give money are already giving it to someone else. So you're not just asking somebody for money, you're asking them to change who they're giving it to or to consider giving more. And that's not quite the same thing as just saying, I'm doing something that's worth supporting, will you please support it? So if you go into your ask with knowledge of who else is asking and how they are positioning themselves as being relevant to the people that they're getting their support from, you may be able to knock some people to the side and take over what they had been receiving. Or you could get, depending on the organization, you might get them to shift their giving policy to allow us, the level of support that you're looking for as well. But one of, like you said, the litmus test for whether you need to change your approach to communicating can easily be how many times do you hear the word no?
When it comes to making the structural change to communications, especially for more established organizations, would you have any kind of benchmarks or guidelines as for how they would go about embracing a more considerate approach to communication?
Yeah, I mean, the first step towards adopting a more considerate approach to communications is to ask yourself the question, what do I know about the people that I'm looking to engage? And to what extent am I including their interests in my pursuit of my intended outcomes? So when you're communicating, anytime anybody's communicating with another person, the onus is on the person who starts the conversation to make it clear what we're talking about. The second step is to speak to the interests of the targeted audience. If I walk into a conversation and just start talking about what I want, it's going to pretty quickly turn off the listener. Whereas if I walk into a conversation with a clear statement of what it is that I would like to talk about and why, and that's followed either by questions of the person that we're talking to get a measure of the framework of their interests, or making statements that are testing statements to see if what I believe that I know about you is accurate. Either way, what you're doing is you're demonstrating interest in the person that you're talking to or the organization that you're talking to, and you're testing the alignment of what I would like to achieve and your likelihood of being interested in working with me to help achieve it.
How important is that testing aspect? You mentioned the word testing different communication strategies, testing different things, and measuring results. How do you feel about different messaging and trying to hone in on kind of something that works a little bit more effectively?
As you know, I used the word testing, and you jumped 5 miles down the road on it. So what I'm talking about is philosophical approach and how you can start putting that into practical use. And yes, what you're talking about testing messages is absolutely vital. But it very much follows a lot of work that you do in working towards an understanding of your targeted audience. So knowing who you're talking to, knowing what they care about, and when I say testing, I mean subtle probing, or you can, if you're doing research, you do it around the underlying motivations of the group that you're talking to.
So let me jump in, because I can hear people already saying, well, of course I'm interested in you. I've been supporting you before. Of course I'm already interested in your cause. How are you talking about being more considerate with somebody who's already aligned with your mission and vision?
Almost any time you present somebody with an insight that speaks to their values and what motivates them, they are pleased and surprised to hear that you understand them. So what I'm talking about is for instance, if the subject at the table is, will you give me a donation? And instead of immediately talk about that, we talk about why it might be meaningful to you to make a donation. What might be motivating you to support, assuming that there's any number of charitable organizations or not-for-profits walking through the door and saying, we understand that you have a large sum of money and we would like you to share some of it with us. You can also assume that they're trained, they're very prepared to say no, because they hear please a lot. So what's the framework for understanding how you get beyond, thanks for coming in, but we're not in a position to help you today, and wow, it was really interesting talking with you. I think we might be interested in supporting your organization. There's any number of ways to get at that, but as I said about disruption earlier, one of them could be to surprise them with something that they hadn't thought about that aligns their values with your goals in an insightful way.
Can we maybe work through an example of that? It could be a real example from your past, or maybe a fictitious example, just how that moment of surprise can change the conversation at the donor level.
A number of years ago, the City of Toronto reduced its funding for the library, which put pressure on the Toronto Public the Toronto Public Library Foundation to increase the support that it was getting from a combination of major donors and people dropping $1 at a time into a bucket at each of the branches. So when I worked with them, one of the immediate goals was to fund the redevelopment of the Metro Reference Library. What we came up with was a message of vitality. Why is the library vital to the city? In what ways does the library matter to the city? And we came up with a package that spoke to the library's relationship to the city, that acted as a whole other framework of consideration rather than just as a place where people go and look at books, or people go and get research materials. It created an understanding of the relationship between the success of the city, the nature of the city, and the library itself. What that gave the foundation the opportunity to do was to speak with people who could fit within the class of major donors, which are a small group of people, and speak to them about bridging their dedication to the city's reputation, their dedication to the specific qualities of the city itself, and gave them an opportunity to participate in shaping it.
So you're looking for sort of insights where people can align with the cause based on something that's bigger than just maybe the overt message of, we're an arts organization or we're a hunger organization. It's trying to pull on a different part of the heartstring.
Yeah, and the ability to have the kind of conversation that you want to have starts with an ability to say, what motivates your giving? When you are considering who to support, what is the first line of consideration, and where does your internal qualifications go after that? Not just from the point of view of, judging our governance and our capabilities and the size of the ask and what we might do with the money, but from a categorical point of view, from a philosophical point of view, what motivates the giving?
So when you have organizations that maybe they have this moment of inspiration where they realize that they need to move towards more of a considerate communication framework, what are the steps involved in getting them to actually put that into place?
It's not an immediately easy answer to offer for that, but because it's philosophically driven. So the first step is to look inwardly as an organization and ask the question, are we empathetic? To what extent, as an organization, do we show that we understand the people that, each other, the world, the people that we're looking to for support? So what might generally happen within the not-for-profit sector is, because you're altruistically motivated, you will assume that empathy is your starting point, which is good, but it might not be your starting point with how you're choosing to communicate. Because it's very easy to fall into the habit, for instance, when you're speaking to people about things that you want, to talk about yourself. This is who we are, this is what we do, this is what we need. And one of the things I've observed over the years is that one of the most unattractive qualities that humans can display to each other is need. So, if you display abject need, you might motivate some people to feel so sorry for you that they will of course reach for their wallets. But if you want to have a more complex relationship with your donors, you want to approach it from a point of view, as I said before, of understanding what motivates them to give. So the way to turn an organization towards being more empathetic, being more considerate in their approach, is to literally challenge yourself and ask the question, how good are we at understanding them? What do we know about our donors? And when I say what do I know about our donors, if your list starts with how much money they've been giving you, what they are in the business of doing, or things within that category, then you're doing it wrong. What you should be talking about is what motivates them to give. Why do they or why should they support us? Who do they support instead of us that we might be able to get them to shift their attention away from? And what insights might we have about our charity that would move them to care about what we care about as much as we do?
But how can you inspire people who may want to go down this path? Maybe they come from a corporate marketing background, but say, yes, this is something I want to do. You've already given a couple of good questions, but when the rubber meets the road and there's a newsletter and a website and an email appeal that's going out, how do you coach people to rein all that in and pull it all together?
So, I've spent years wondering, can you teach empathy? And one of the conclusions I've come to is you can't teach people to be empathetic, but you can help people hone their skills. So in other words, if you're already empathetic, you can teach people how to demonstrate their empathy better. But more importantly, whereas it's hard to teach an individual how to demonstrate their empathetic capabilities, you can create corporate habits and manage those habits very consciously into the expected behaviors of an organization, because from an HR point of view, you can list what you want those qualities to be and measure how they are seen to be incorporated in people's day-to-day activities. One example I'll give of this, which is kind of fun. It's not for a not-for-profit. It was for a for-profit company, but they were a manufacturing and design of office furniture. And when we did the research, where we were talking to all the different people in the company and kind of trying to get an understanding of their culture and how they managed themselves, one of the things that I recognized pretty quickly was that almost everybody in the company had a habit of saying no departmentally to the other people in the company. So when one department was trying to achieve something that required the cooperation of another department, they would say, we would like to do this and this is the deadline. And the other department would say, oh, we can't possibly meet that deadline because we're so busy with these things. And then the department that said, we can't possibly meet your deadline, then had some of their own deadlines to get equipment set up and raw materials ordered. And they'd speak to the departments that were supposed to do that and would be told, that's very difficult. We'll get back to you and tell you whether we can or not. So when we did the brand and we launched it internally, one of the things that we challenged the company with was, you're no longer allowed to say no. Nobody in this company is allowed to say no to anybody else. You can say no problem, and we gave them t-shirts that said no problem, and we gave them mugs that said no problem, and we put posters up around the manufacturing facilities that had interesting catchphrases and headlines that said no problem at the bottom, and challenged senior management to make sure that it stuck. And when I came back in touch with them 3 years later, it was working. There was, it's not like the company was perfect now, but they had taught their staff interdepartmental consideration. And what the internal staff, what all the different departments experienced was, actually, if we stop getting in each other's way, things are a lot easier overall. But everybody was so focused on the pressure that they were feeling themselves that they didn't think about the opportunity they could be creating for their coworkers. But when they all spontaneously started, switching towards being helpful instead of being impediments, it just was like throwing a switch.
So as I listen to that story, what it strikes me is that you took a communications approach to solving a transforming brand problem, transforming the brand internally. And I guess the question is, chicken and egg, does the communication solve the brand problem, or does the brand inform the communication strategy? And how do nonprofits reconcile this if they haven't put in the energy and effort into defining their brand?
Without getting into specifics about the client, the brand work that we did for the client absolutely depended on it sold the idea of effectiveness and required the company to be effective so that they could communicate effectiveness to their clients as well. So one of the key things to understand about brand is it is always about internally adjusting your culture so that you can always deliver on a promise that you're consciously making. And externally, it's about making that promise in a way that's compelling and interesting to your target audiences.
And that's where the considerate communication comes in, by reinforcing the brand promise you made through those interesting insights that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. And underpinning it all is it has to be true. There has to be something that's relevant in a very human way that people can understand. And when you reduce it to its most simple expression, nobody will say, I don't get it.
So when you have considerate communications that reinforces something that is not only true about your organization, but true about your audience, how does that stack up from a longevity standpoint?
The best brands in the world are using the same promise now as they used when they first established their brands, because there's a relationship between the truth of their organization as they proposed it and the truth of their organizations as they have managed themselves towards delivering on that truth forward over time.
So what would you sort of in closing, what would you say to nonprofits that are maybe struggling, maybe they're not getting the results they want, they're getting told no more often than they would like? What would you say their next steps should be?
Earlier in the conversation, I said, assuming what you're doing is worthwhile. So every nonprofit out there is based on the idea that something that the nonprofit itself feels is as important as they think it is. If you ask the question, are we as important as we think we are, and why? When you come up with the answers to those questions, that should become the beginning of how you talk to your target audiences, because the next question becomes, who might agree with us? So if you already have a donor base, you can test that, because essentially anybody who's giving you money will also be willing to answer some questions for you. So if you go out and say to them, we really appreciate your support, we're looking to expand our reach, can you tell us a little bit about why you care about us as much as we're happy that you do? You can do some research that way. As well, you can hypothesize. Here's the things that we think are important about us. And you can, as you said earlier, alluded to earlier, you can test those ideas. And again, go out to people who you already have relationships with and say, how important is this? Are we right to think this? And if you can challenge yourself to come up with some insights that turn the traditional thinking upside down or surprise you. A good example of this would be World Vision Canada. A number of years ago, like probably 15 or 20 years ago, stopped saying, give us money, and they started saying, donate a goat. If you give this much money, it's a goat. And then they told the story of what difference a goat makes to a farmer in the community where they were going to be putting the goat. And the same thing with a chicken, and the same thing with a well, or the same thing. So the charities, the not-for-profits that have come up with storytelling around what you can achieve in a humanized way. One version of it is your money can do this, can make this much good for this long. Another one is, if you buy a desk for a school in this country, it means these girls can be educated. And I know that, for instance, I was telling you before, Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC supports desks for girls in Malawi. And the whole idea behind it is If women are educated, they become the leaders of the community. And if we invest in the education of girls, they become the leaders of the community, and we can make a long-term difference in a community that where the support is needed and will be felt. So really humanizing the story in a way that gives you the ability to talk about it differently. It's now no longer how much money can you give us? It's now a story of support.